stay flexible and go with the flow.
Okay.
Roll.
Interview with Mr. James W. Johnson on 22 May 2001, Lexington Avenue Armory in New York City. Interviewer is Lieutenant Colonel Robert von Hassel, and the videographer is Mr. Wayne Clark. Mr. Johnson, tell me, where and when were you born?
I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, July the 11th, 1921.
And did you come to New York before the war, or?
Yes, we came to New York when I was 4 years of age, and I lived in New York primarily after that, up until after the war. Then I started moving around a little bit.
Tell me about your family, your mother, your father.
Well, my mother was born in, my mother and father both were born in Norfolk, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And my father came up to New York first, and then we followed, maybe 6 months later. And this has been our residence mostly ever since.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I had there were 9 of us, 6 boys, 3 girls. And at the present time, there are 2 boys left. I'm the oldest and the youngest, and my 3 sisters are still living.
And where did you move in New York? What part of New York did you live in?
All of my movement has been in Harlem.
So what was Harlem like in the 20s and 30s growing up?
Well, you felt some of the pulse of what they are now referred to as the Renaissance. There were clubs all over the place. There were bars. There were the famous places, the Apollo Theater, the Savoy Ballroom, etc. And I grew up with all of that in full motion. I was there when Joe Louis and his famous fight with Max Schmeling, and I was part of the group that ran up and down 125th Street banging on pots and pans in celebration and so forth. So that was the heyday of Harlem, as it's referred to today, because it's not the same anymore.
Now, you entered the Army in October of 1941?
October 21st, 1941.
So,
like yesterday.
what were you doing before you entered the Army?
Okay, I was in college.
Mm-hmm.
I had graduated from high school, and I was a pre-med student at City College of New York.
Why did you join the Army?
I was drafted.
Oh.
I had only been in college 2 years, 2.5 years. And if you had become a medical student, post-college, a graduate of college into medical school, you would have been deferred, and you would have ended up in the Army anyway because of the war, but you would have been they would have waited for you to become a doctor.
Mm-hmm. So, what happened in October when you were drafted? Tell me about your first experiences in the Army.
Well, we went into Fort Dix, New Jersey, and that was the processing station. And I remember that they made me take the test, the IQ test. I took it the first time, and the guy said, "There must be a mistake here." He says, "You made 144. He said, "That didn't happen." So they tested me the second time. And then they gave me my choice of branches, because I went into the medics. I went as a trainee at Camp Lee, Virginia. That was the medic and quartermaster training station.
Mm-hmm.
Left there and was assigned to an air base outside of Sumter, South Carolina, Shaw Field,
Mm-hmm.
Shaw Air Force Base. There they were training combat pilots. And now, threaded throughout all of this, I was beginning to feel the existence of the segregation that existed in the Army at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Your training was all segregated, wasn't it?
well, then the basic training, we were a segregated unit. All of the enlisted men were black.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the officers, and initially some of the non-commissioned officers were white.
Mm-hmm.
But we were not mixed as trainees. We were all black.
Give me some more examples. How was segregation in the Army in those days?
It was complete. When I say complete, for instance, when we got assigned to the unit down at the Air Force Base, all the black troops were in 2 barracks. And we had a white commanding officer who would come over in the morning and do his, whatever he was doing legislatively, administratively, and then he would leave. And we were left with our sergeants and the enlisted cadre were all white. And we were the service unit for that Air Force Base.
Mm-hmm.
And I happened to become the company sergeant, and it was my duty to send the men out for whatever they were to be assigned for all over the base. Mm-hmm. And that went along for, there was one very stark situation. When we were first sent there, I was sent as a medical specialist, sent to open up the laboratory at that hospital. There were 2 of us assigned to it. And we worked there maybe a month, and then they sent in 2 white fellows. And we were told, train these fellows, because they'll work with you. And ultimately, we were training them because they were going to give them the assignments and the rank and the rating to operate that medical lab, really, at the hospital. Mm-hmm. And that was my first real bite of the segregation and the application of it. So I went to the company office and worked as a clerk there until I went to Officers Candidate School.
Before we get into OCS, what about off-post? You know, you come out of Harlem.
Off-post, now we were in, but when I was in Virginia, there was not too much time for that. We were in basic training, and the only real traumatic incident that I had was on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. I was prepared to go on a date. A young lady was preparing a very, very special meal for me at a city outside the post. And so I didn't eat lunch, preparing myself for this dinner. We had one radio in the barracks, and on the radio we did hear something about Pearl Harbor. But up until that time, I had never even heard of Pearl Harbor, so we didn't realize the significance of what that little blurb on the radio meant. Mm-hmm. There was only one radio in the entire barracks, and nobody, we weren't listening to it. So I got ready to go to town, got on the bus, the military police got on the bus at the main gate, said, "Whoa, all military personnel are frozen on the post. Go back to your quarters." I went to take the bus that went out the back gate. I said, "Wait a minute, I got to get to this thing." I'm hungry, this lady has prepared this delicious meal for me. And the same thing happened. At the back gate, you couldn't get out. And we were frozen on the post for about a week. And I think about at that time, I always use the expression, I could have whipped the whole Japanese army by myself. I was so angry. However, at Camp Lee, there was not too much time off to really get the feeling of the segregation. But when we got down to Sumter, South Carolina, there, initially, the first payday, our men went into town, they got drunk, and the civilian police just followed through on what seemed to be a custom in that area. They catch a black drunk, they whip on his head, take him to jail, and let him sleep it off overnight. And they had maybe, I don't remember, maybe a dozen of our men in that situation. And immediately we had a meeting with the commander of the police, the commander of the post, and we eventually developed our own military police from among the blacks. And there was an understanding that if there was any of our men that they picked up that word drunk, they would turn them over to us, we'd bring them back, take them back to the post without their getting their heads beaten, because that first payday was kind of horrible. But that was, again, the police kind of resented it. It was quite a while before it settled down to the point where they accepted the military police that we sent into town, and they gave them, you know, they understood their mission, and they began to cooperate.
What about other things off post besides the police? I mean, you'd come out of Harlem, you basically, you know, had the freedom of Harlem, do what you want.
Well,
now suddenly
the town down there was you know, you lived in the people who lived in the black section, they were there. They had a public school and a high school, and there was no mixing of the students whatsoever. It was a black community, and unless you went, when I say outside the community, there were certain stores they didn't go to. Or there were certain stores that they went to the way they went there, and they understood. They were not going to be, for instance, there was no service in anybody's cafeteria or restaurant. It was just understood. If blacks wanted to be served, they had to go around to a back door and pick their food up. They couldn't sit down in the restaurant.
Soldiers had to do this too?
Soldiers also. Didn't matter about your uniform. The fact that you were in uniform meant nothing. If you went there with a face like mine, you could not get served.
Well, what about public transportation? Did they enforce blacks to the back of the bus, that kind of stuff?
Well, and your transportation was the same. When we went down, back and forth a couple of times on the train, visited New York, went back down south on the train, and you rode wherever you were assigned or wherever you got on the train from New York to Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., or some place in Maryland, you went to what they called the Jim Crow car. Whether you were in uniform, out of uniform, it didn't matter. That law was strictly enforced. So throughout the South, blacks and whites were not riding together on a train or bus.
You're from
any public.
Yeah, you're from New York. I mean, you're used to getting on any bus you want to. You sit where you want to.
That's right.
So how does this make you feel?
Well, naturally you resented it, but you weren't going to start another war. We were preparing ourselves to fight either the Japanese or Hitler, but I've always, of course, thought of a book, and the title of the book in my mind, I've made a few notes even, has been "We Fought Two Wars." But again, you aren't going to overtly start any trouble just because you were angered at the fact that you had to sit in the back of a bus, or couldn't eat in a restaurant, or in some cases they wanted you to walk off the street if a white person approached you, which we didn't do in uniform. But that we didn't, you know, we didn't adhere to that. But all the rest of it, you were forced to. Because if you were taken before, we had men who got into situations and were brought before the commanding officer, and they said, okay, now we had fellows from Chicago, New York, and so forth. And he'd say, this is the custom here, and we have to adhere to the customs.
Now tell me about OCS. How did you get into OCS? I mean,
okay, I applied for, I had applied for the administrative corps.
mhm.
Because I was coming through administration, that's what I was working at. I said, I'll go to the OCS for the administration. It turned out that Air Force administration was quartered in Miami Beach. So I sent my request for the orders. I was working with the adjutant at the air base. He and I had become very friendly, and he was, you know, he recognized that I had a few abilities, and he was encouraging me to go along, move forward. And when the orders came back, they came back for the infantry OCS. And I said, I didn't apply for infantry. And so then he said, you know, he was trying to placate me. He says, well, listen, they're beginning to put together infantry divisions, black infantry divisions, and they're going to need good officers. And he says, I believe you'll make a good officer. He says, and I'm asking you to think about that and think about this. And I told him that, hey, okay, I'll go ahead and continue where I am here on the base. I was the person in charge of dispensing all of the troops, and I had my own vehicle and so forth as a perk. But it turns out that the administrative OCS in Florida, Miami Beach, Florida, as a matter of fact, I would have been in the same class that Clark Gable attended.
Mhm.
But they would not think of putting a black in that course as a mixed situation.
So you went off to Fort Benning?
So I eventually ended up at Fort Benning, and at Fort Benning I was OCS class number 93, and all of the blacks were in one hut, and the rest of the men were spread throughout the rest of the compound. We were part of a 3rd platoon. We were always in a squad to ourselves, although we had the same platoon leader as the rest of the platoon did. But it went the only time that we really began to feel the separation was when it came time to graduate. And at graduation time, there was to be a company party. And hey, we hadn't really felt any of the segregation, except the fact that we were in this separate squad, and we worked together. But when it came to company situations, you worked with the company, etc. But the party, the company commander called us together and said, listen, we can't have a mixed party. So we'll provide you guys with an allowance. So you go into town, you pick out, and that was Columbus, Georgia. So you'll pick out a place that you want to have your party. You can invite your friends, etc. But we cannot have a mixed party. And that was the only time that it really hit home there. And then to leave that, got the commission, was assigned to the 365th Infantry of the 92nd Division. The 92nd was one of the two black divisions that were put together. One was the 93rd, which had we call it the upside down teapot. It was a helmet in reverse. That was their insignia. Our insignia was the buffalo, the 92nd. And we didn't run into the separateness or the segregation till the very first meeting we had with the regimental commander. He paced up and down the stage. First officer's call. He paced up and down the stage. And now in OCS, now they were telling me, I said, now, once you get your commission, you're considered a gentleman in the Army. And one of the things you keep in mind that there's a separateness between you and enlisted men. But you're considered a gentleman once you have your commission. Fine. At this first officer's call, the colonel is still pacing. He must have paced about 5 minutes up and down the stage before he finally turned and faced the collected group. And he said, gentlemen and colored officers. And then he went on with the rest of what he had as a speech. And so that was possibly the second title that I thought of for a book, Gentlemen and Colored Officers.
Now, where was this?
This was in Camp Atterbury. See, the division collected, well, we were at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, the 365th, plus our field artillery, etc. The 370th was in another town. I think they were in Kentucky. The 371st and all of their components, I think, were in Arkansas. And our initial training was there at Camp Atterbury. And then we, at some stage of training, they determined that the division would come together, and we continued the training of the entire division collectively at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. At Fort Huachuca, the 93rd had been there prior to our being there. And when they cleared out, I guess, then we went in. And then you had the entire division at Fort Huachuca. That's where we completed our training for combat. We left Fort Huachuca temporarily to go into maneuvers, combat maneuvers in Louisiana, the Louisiana maneuver area. And all this time, of course, you've got a complement of black troops. You had black and white officers. And we had no real problems except that, let's go back to Camp Atterbury, and they were putting everything together for operations, and they put up an officers club. And they said, okay, the officers club is open. Everybody went. And somebody suddenly realized that at that first session of our officers club, there were black officers and white officers together. So we had another very flurry of activity, called everybody together, says, okay, we can't have a mixed club, gentlemen. We'll give you funds, have your club officer, but you'll have your own club. So they broke down one of the kitchens, and the kitchen building was used for the first club anyway. So they gave us another building, set us up with our whatever, and we had our own club. And it was understood that we were not welcome in the white club. And the commanding officer came to the opening of our club, and after that we never saw him again there. It was just the blacks. So that was the next lashing, you know. But again, they said this is what's going on throughout the entire army. Because we had a committee, went to the regimental commander and says, come on, if we're going to prepare ourselves for a war that we got to fight together, why is this going on? And he says, this is not anything that's different from any post in this entire United States Army. He said that we're not about to go against what they considered to be their instructions from Washington. So that ended when we got out to Fort Huachuca. There they had already prepared. We didn't have to go through the matter. They said the Black Officers Club is over in this section and the other Officers Club is someplace else. And so we went through that period of training without further incident in reference to that.
Now, the black officers were all junior officers? Were there any black senior officers?
Well, no, we, I think we started out, everyone was a second lieutenant. Every black was a second lieutenant. And coming out of either OCS or there are a number of officers who had graduated from ROTC at their respective colleges. You had, down in Washington, D.C., the Howard University had an ROTC, and throughout the country you had a couple of black, you had I think about 3 active black colleges that had ROTC. And so that when out of ROTC they came out as second lieutenants. They were given an assignment in our division or wherever else they may have gone. That's where you started. So that without exception, every black officer in our division started out as a second
Now, how long were you in training before you went overseas?
Let's see, we started training in, it was approximately a year and a half.
Did you feel confident? Did you feel like you were well trained when you?
Oh yes, we had no doubt about the fact. See, what we did after we got over the fact that, you know, there was this separation to this place or that place, but the fact that we were going to be committed to combat, and we were responsible. Every officer was responsible for the training. And you received from the S3 or the G3, you received your training statistics and your lesson plans and so forth. And they were pretty much the same, I think, that any unit, white or black, had to use. And we were trained to I think, in the latest in terms of techniques and combat situations and formations, etc. So I think we were in step with the rest of the United States Army when it came to our training. So that when we went into combat, and we trained with the idea that we were taking these men into combat, and without exception, I think everybody gave full measure. There was no holding back.
Now tell us about the unit in combat.
The unit for combat?
No, tell us about how the unit got
into combat.
Yeah.
Okay, we went overseas, went over on Liberty ships. Our regiment landed at Leghorn, that's Leghorn in Italy. We were marshaled into an area, prepared immediately to go into the line. We relieved a unit of the 442nd Battalion, which was the Japanese battalion. And we went into, on I think about the third day, we were online in right up above Viareggio, Italy, on what was called the Cinquale Canal. And at the Cinquale Canal, on the other side of it, was a fully, well, the Germans were pretty well dug in over there. And we stayed in that position until we were moved into another combat area. But naturally, they were patrolling. Patrols went out, because I was in I was a machine gun platoon leader in a heavy weapons company. So we were always assigned to any one of the combat companies in our battalion, and the rifle companies. So that about the third day, we were put up in the line, and from that point on, the Germans let you know every minute almost of every day that they were in the hills up above you. As a matter of fact, they had the high ground. And we were, to hold that line, we had to really move around. You couldn't walk anywhere once you got beyond a certain point, because you were under their observation more than we could observe them.
What time, about what month and year was it that you first went on the
Okay,
line?
we started, we went over in, I think we went over in October. And October 44. was the winter time, going into the winter time. It was cold. And but again, holding that line seemed to have been, well, not that it seemed to have been, it was critically important, because our left flank was the Adriatic Sea.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and then we extended on over, and from time to time we were either flanked on our right by the 10th Mountain Division, and there was a very famous skier, Torger Toko. I think he died in combat over in that section. We either had the 10th Mountain Division or the British 8th Army, always on our right. And on our left initially was the ocean, so that that particular position was considered to be a critical position. The Germans tried a few incursions, but they never got through there. Matter of fact, when we went into the position, and as I went around for inspection of the gun places, we still had dead German soldiers in the area that we had to cover.
So the unit basically spent the rest of the war in northern Italy?
Yes, exclusively.
What else, anything else in particular you remember about your combat experiences with the regiment? Anything that leaps out?
Yes, it was, we had one thing that had gone into effect that we were able to recognize, the fact that every company commander, every rifle company commander that was white was pulled back to a position in battalion staff, regimental staff, and every one of our frontline rifle companies throughout the entire regiment was then commanded by a black officer. We had one situation, and our commanding general, General Allman, A-L-M-O-N-D, I'll never forget the time, and he was blood and guts. He said, "Gentlemen, number one," he says, "I'll never let you be assigned to dig ditches." He says, "We're training for combat." He says, "And that's what we expect to do. We're going to fight." One of the times that we're still on the Cinquale Canal, they pulled us all back for a sand table exercise about 10 miles back on the beach. And each battalion had its own area that they were going to give the general a rundown on how they were going to carry out the operation, because this was in preparation for crossing the Cinquale Canal and attacking the Germans on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And the S3, who had been a company commander, and he was white, he was giving his version of the attack for our battalion. And the general said, "Whoa, wait a minute." And he stopped them a couple of times and he told them, essentially he said, "What you're saying is completely out of line and almost crazy." He asked the battalion commander, where was this man before he became your S3? He said, "He was the commander of F Company." He says, "Send him back here to his company." He says, "You and I will work out your battalion involvement in case this battalion has to attack the Cinquale Canal." And that just, not that I got any relief or I was happy about that situation, but it gave me belief in the commanding general that he wasn't for any horsing around. He was very, very serious about our becoming, a unit that was going to function at its maximum in combat.
Let's hold there for a minute because we're going to have to switch tape. Tape 2, interview with Mr. James W. Johnson on 22 May 2001. Mr. Johnson, we were talking about combat in northern Italy. Anything else come to mind, particular?
Well, yeah, we had about 4 engagements that we were involved with in our battalion. And they were all very active, they were all very dangerous, and I had a sniper almost get me, but during one of the lulls in the combat, and we had heard that the same Captain Yalis, I didn't call his name before, who had been sent back to his company, he, during one of the approach marches, I understand that from the lieutenant from our company who was supporting that company in that advance, said he used some crazy kind of approach march formation that was really not in the books. At any rate, they got up to their contact point with the Germans, with the entire battalion got involved, and I think it was maybe on the second day, it was reported that this Captain Yalis, was killed. The people from the Graves Registration Office, GRO, while we were just holding our ground and, sort of a waiting position, it came forth to pick up dead bodies and so forth. And this other fellow, his name is Johnson also, Lieutenant Johnson, he'd been assigned to GRO. And he said, he'd been given orders, can't touch Captain Yalis's body until an inspection unit or inspection group goes up and sees how he died. Now, there's always been talk, I think, throughout the military that officers don't necessarily get killed from the action of the enemy, that if they were someone who wasn't liked in a particular way, they might end up with a bullet from the back. But it was, conversation. It's never anything that I knew personally that it would happen. And when he said this, that's the first thing that went through my mind. What ran through my mind was, well, they're not satisfied that he died as a result of German action. Mm-hmm. There's a possibility that they suspected that it was, that he died as a result of some action on the part of some of the people in his command. But the scene that they finally found really proved that there was nothing more than the fact that he had put his command post upstairs in a building beyond his own line and under direct fire of the German artillery, and they put an 88 shell in that window, and he and I think it was 6 or 7 of the men in his command post were killed. so that put to rest the fact that his death was something suspicious. But there was a man assigned by the War Department. I can't call his name at the moment. It may come to me as I relate this incident. His was the job to find out whether or not any of our men ran in the face of combat. Now, they had one situation that took place. You had the 366th Infantry, which was from Massachusetts. Now, this was a complete black unit. Their commanding officer on down were black. They had been assigned, given the assignment of protecting air bases out of North Africa. They went into combat, or they went into security positions in North Africa, and then followed the 15th Air Force all the way up through Italy. Mm-hmm. And when they got up to the point where we were at that time, now this was a time when the Germans had in Europe had you had that big scene of Bastogne where the Germans had a complete, I mean, they threw everything they had into the line. Well, we had the same incident, the same situation in Italy. They were on the move, counterattacking, so that to build up or give us support, they brought the 366th Infantry in line to attack or to support, be in support of our unit, the 365th. They put it in our area. Now, they had not been in contact with the enemy except for firing anti-aircraft, barrages at anybody that might have attacked the air bases. That night, the forward unit, an advance unit of the 366, came into our command post. I was in G Company. I was support of G Company with my machine guns. They were in place and so forth. This fellow comes up, so it's, I think 3 or 4 of them. They had come up through the line at night, about 2 o'clock in the morning. They came into the CP, says, gentlemen, we're supposed to attack in the morning. He says, and we've got to attack on these coordinates. And the coordinates that he pointed to, which was, a little black spot on the map. The little black spot was a kind of a tool shed that we were using as a command post for the company commander of G Company. And he says, this is where was to be the focus of our attack. And we checked and rechecked. Said, where did you get this? This is where you're sitting right now. He said, well, this is what they gave us at Regiment, and then we got to Battalion. Battalion further, laid it out for them. He said, and this is where we're supposed to attack in the morning. And of course, we told them, something's wrong somewhere. Now, we couldn't call back on the radio to Battalion, the company commander, but he sent, I think his executive officer, whoever was there as his liaison, back with this group, back to Battalion, to let them know that they had selected, or at least this lieutenant was under the impression that he was supposed to attack us because, in terms of the coordinate, straighten it out, somebody. So by the following morning, of course, now we were in position, we were frozen in position. They had to move, come up on our right flank, come up, and we were at the base of a very high mountain. Their mission was to go on up the rest of the way up to the top of that hill and to secure it. And they were, I think they had a company or a two-company front to do this with. When they got to the top of the hill, we were watching. You could, and we were looking at them through our glasses. At the top, they looked like little specks. But you could see the guys walking around, and it was wintertime, and they had on their parkas and so forth. And all of a sudden, you know, the Germans hit them. The Germans were very good at one maneuver, counterattacking. If you hit them, you knew that you had to be prepared for them to come back, for them to counterattack. So over in that sector, they started a rolling barrage of these fellows who were up on, had gotten up on this ridge. They didn't have time to dig in. They got up there, they were walking around. I guess they were feeling pretty confident because all they got was some artillery fire and mortar fire. And then all of a sudden, they let loose with everything they had. And I understand they started a counterattack. The guys were not in position and ready to resist it. So they rolled back down the hill. Now, I understand that this is a story that's told. I wasn't on the scene, but that the assistant division commander was back behind their unit because this is the first time that they had been put into combat. So that they were forced to vacate that area until they could regroup back in the rear. Now to leave that, that was the only time that I knew that any of our troops had to retreat.
And yet, was this what caused the War Department to send somebody to see if the black soldier was running?
Now, this gentleman said that because maybe 3 weeks later, we were off the front line, we were back in a position in the way. We were in support, pull us back in support. So while we were there, we were setting up machine gun training because you have faces of cliffs. You can fire into the cliffs without worrying about what's going on. And we were going through some training. This fellow comes up, he says he's been assigned by the War Department to see whether black soldiers were running. So I said, and because I was in charge of the firing that was going on, he was talking to me. I said, well, none of our soldiers have run in the face of the enemy. I said, we may have maneuvered right and left in order to get better positions, in order to advance our positions, but we have not run in the face of the enemy or run under any other circumstances. And he said, well, I have been given to understand that some people were running. Now this is, the gentleman that's talking is a black man, but he's been given this assignment to see if black troops are running. Now I know what they're talking about because the 366 was forced to get off that hill until they could regroup, which I understand, you know, they regrouped, they did, and they went on back, and they took the hill, and they solidified the line that they had to complete, and so forth. But on that particular morning, they had no alternative but to roll off that hill until they could get themselves back together. Because Jerry threw everything he had with the kitchen sink. I think the kitchen sink went. They really, I mean, the eruptions off on the side of that hill. We're all laying on the left, watching this rolling barrage. And the explosions and the bursts. And you can, every shell that hit, you could see the, you know, the dirt fly up in the air and so forth. But that was this gentleman's, I can't call his name now, but I swore that if ever I got home, anybody that I would have wanted to put my fists right square in his face would have been him, because he was pushing the issue of black soldiers running in combat. And it just didn't happen. None of the men that I know of, none of the men in any of the regiments that were in our division, because we went back and, you know, after the war was over and so forth, we got together and had a discussion about this. And there was just another attempt to paint the black as being incompetent in combat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they did the same thing to the 99th Pursuit Squad. Until, if you've seen the movie, then you know that it's an absolute fact.
I've done better than that. I've talked to Tuskegee Airmen.
Okay. Yeah, I know a couple of them personally. Percy Sutton is one of them.
Percy Sutton was? I didn't know that. We're hoping to interview Roscoe Brown.
Oh, Roscoe Brown, of course. The up at, have you talked to him yet?
No, not me personally. Another guy did, trying to set up the interview.
But he has been, okay.
And,
because he's the president up at the Bronx Community College. Yes.
Clarence Stewart.
I know him personally. Yes.
Governor Pataki helped me interview Clarence Stark.
Yeah.
He was retired as a lieutenant colonel.
But, you know, they were, there's, I don't know what to say, the fact that you went over there to fight, and you went over there to fight not to create any problems within your own ranks. I think our commitment, to the extent that I know it, was as great as any other American who wanted to get rid of Hitler, get rid of whoever was opposing us. Mm-hmm. And of course, there was always this underlying thought, and it was fed to you from time to time, that fighting and getting rid of your enemy would lead to, you know, the elimination of segregation in the Army, or elimination of segregation in our country. You've done your job, you fought the fight, and everybody pitched in. The ladies at home they went in as Rosie the Riveter alongside everybody else in order to put out the supplies necessary to back up the war effort. And when he came home, there was no change.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because
Yeah.
we have a few other things I wanted to ask you about, and
Yes.
we're getting low on time. When you came home,
Yes.
what did you do after the war?
Okay, after the war, I went, I had married while I was in the service, because I had said I wasn't going to marry until I finished medical school. But I said, well, I'm in the war, I don't know how to get killed. I'll go ahead and marry and get as much as I can out of marriage. Had a little girl waiting for me to come home, my daughter. But I went back to school. I went to college, went back to City College to complete it there. But then I began to run into the fact that I was having more children than I could afford to support and go to school,
Mm-hmm.
and that, so I started working, so that I never did get into medical school. But I had made application to medical school, And at that time, I was told I had a 7-year waiting list in Columbia University here in the city. Up and down I wanted to go to school up here so that I could be close to my family if I was going to go to school. Now there were black colleges that had medical, had medical courses, had medical schools, and very good colleges. But when I applied up here, and almost without exception, the least amount of time that I would have had to wait, according to them, was 7 years before I could expect to go into medical school, to start medical training.
Now, you joined the reserves after the war?
Yes, I did.
When was that?
I joined the reserve the day I signed out. And I was assigned to the 77th Division, right here in New York City, the Liberty Patch.
How long were you with them?
I stayed with the 77th until I actually retired from the service.
What were your assignments in the 77th?
On the 77th, now initially we were going to school. Our headquarters was on 529 West 42nd Street. As a matter of fact, the building that has gone co-op, I think they still call it the Armory. But for maybe the first couple of years, we attended classes. We were assigned to units, we attended classes, and you didn't know really who was in your unit, who wasn't. You just, as a group, we all attended classes. At the very first muster, when we went to Camp Drum, the very first time we went to Camp Drum, and the first muster on that Monday morning, when everyone lined up to answer roll call, we realized that in the 307th Infantry, the 3rd Battalion was all black. And we didn't know that until that formation. As a matter of fact, there's during the war, if you were Puerto Rican, you were listed as W on your 201. We had a lieutenant, Santiago, and he and I have the same complexion. People look at us and used to think we were brothers. He was over in the 2nd Battalion. And when the adjutant called his name, and Ricky said, "Here," and the adjutant looked up and said, "What are you doing over here, Lieutenant?" He said, "I've been assigned to this company, E Company, I think it was." He said, "I've been assigned since for the last 2 or 3 years." And the guy almost snatched him out of rank, says, "We'll straighten that out." He brought him bodily over to the 3rd Battalion. And at the end of that formation, I went to see, I asked guys, I said, "You want to go with me?" I said, "Well, I'm going to talk to the regimental commander." And we had a sweet old gentleman. He said, "Johnny," he says, "this is the way it is." I said, "I'm wearing the Liberty Patch. I'm in a reserve unit in the New York City area, and I'm part of a segregated unit." I said, "How does that be?" I said, "That doesn't measure up." And he said, "Well, look, that's the way it is." Now, he says, I said, "Let's go see our commanding general." Now, our commanding general at that time in the 77th was Julius Ox Adler. It was the New York Times. And what Colonel Westerman said to me was, "Johnny," he says, "you got a little heat on you right now." He says, "Tell you what," he says, "I'm going to talk to the general, and let's see if we can't get something done about this. I said, okay, for the moment, we'll leave it like that. And later on, he told me, he says, well, listen, we're trying to work on something. He says, and we're in connection, we're in contact with the War Department down in Washington, et cetera, et cetera. He says, but at the moment, he says, this, throughout the entire country, he says, this is still going on. So that, and the Army has not changed since the time you were in service. And I said, I think this is, terrible. Every officer in our regiment that I could talk to, I asked, so do you think this is right? And, what do you feel about this? And some of them backed away. It was kind of like a hot potato. And they, there were a lot of fellows, white, who thought that this was a travesty, and it shouldn't have been. But again, that's the way it was. And it didn't change until, the presidential order came out, integrating the armed services.
So, you were originally in the 307th Infantry?
In the 77th.
In the 77th?
Yes.
What other duties did you have in the 77th?
Say again?
What are the duties later on?
Oh, well, let's see. After the integration, I was a company commander, headquarters company commander. Then I was assigned as a motor officer. Let's see. I started out as an intelligence officer, then company commander, then a motor officer. And I think the motor officer was, for the battle group, was my last real assignment in the battle group until I was transferred out to the school unit.
Mm-hmm. And when was your last year of assignment with the 77th?
That was approximately, I can only give you an approximation at the moment, but that was approximately 1967, 1968, somewhere around there. And I attended the Command and General Staff School through the 1150th ARSU until my separation.
Well, I want to talk. I wish we had more time to talk about the 77th because we rarely get to meet people who served in the 77th in those years,
Right.
and those are very critical years, to the history of that division.
Yes.
Maybe we can I hope maybe we can get together sometime and talk some more about that.
It's okay.
But I'm going to give you, so we don't run too far over time, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about today or something I didn't ask about?
Oh, well, no. At the moment, now, I'm still a member of the 77th Division Reserve Officers Association. As a matter of fact, we just had our spring social about 2 weeks ago. And Mickey Goldman is he's the warrant officer that has been the mortar to that mix that has kept that unit intact and has been very, very supportive and so forth all these years.
Again, one thing that you mentioned, 529 42nd Street?
That's correct. That was the first armory that we attended.
And it wasn't until later that they got out to Fort Totten?
Fort Totten, Fort Totten became whenever we had weekends to spend, we spent them at Fort Totten for many years. There were a lot of weekends we went to Fort Dix, but quite a number of them were spent at Fort Totten for weekend training. so that, and I think it was just a natural progression of things that Fort Sutton became the headquarters of the 77th Archon.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating stuff. Any other thoughts or comments?
No, I think I've touched on all of the sticky points and all of the other things that would have been said. And, just to wrap it up, I think that a person like myself would have been less than, been less than, I'll use the word noble, to do anything other than what we do. I was there to serve my country. I understood the frailties and some of the things that were going on in the country that were an absolute, anathema.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always looked at the fact that things had to improve, without conflict. I believe in the Martin Luther King theory. I think he was one of our greatest leaders. He did most for us in terms of progress, which is about to become a retrogression now. But
do you feel that your time in World War II changed your life in any way?
oh yes.
How so?
Well, number one, I learned that to be in combat with men that you've trained was something that had to be done in a very, very special way. There were officers who followed the old line, of being autocratic. They believed in the fact that an enlisted man was a lower form of person, and I never really accepted that. After I got into training men, I believe that we all have a job to do. I use the analogy to them. I said, when you're at home, you got a job. Your job requires that you follow whoever is in charge, that you give them respect, but they, in turn, need to respect you. And I think the one thing that I learned was that the man that I trained, if I was to have him respect me, I had to respect him as a man and treat him as such. And that's the way I've gone through my military career.
Great. I think that's a good point to end on.